All right. Hello to everyone who is filtering in to our Zoom room here and everyone joining us on Facebook. We've just got about 3 minutes here and we'll get started. So welcome. Can't get my background to load. All right. The vagaries of starting with a new computer. How you doing, Grant?
Doing well. Doing well. It's been a good day. Had some interesting meetings, some productive ones. It was a good day.
Fantastic. I have been walking the dog around campus and inspecting the corn over here. What's the corn looking like up at your place?
It's actually looking really good. It's we've gotten a lot of rain this summer, and so it's really doing its thing. I had to put some netting on it. The crows had found it, and we're starting to raise a little cane, but I've got it covered now, so hopefully that'll prevent the crows from doing any damage, but we'll see.
Sorry about that. I just keep crashing here. If it's the weather or my new computer or what. Oh boy. I see I'm frozen. Okay. All right. I'm back. Do you guys see me? Am I a real person? Okay. But well, I'm glad you're keeping the birds out and that the corn's looking good. Yeah. I always figure that it looks better in your gardens than down here because that's usually how it works. So,
Yeah, we've been lucky up there so far. It's been pretty good harvest every year.
yeah.
It's good.
There seems to be a lot of flowers growing in the corn gardens down here. So
Yeah, it's pretty.
yeah, it is. It looks lovely. All right. Taylor, you back there in the background sharing for me?
Yep, you should be seeing my screen, are you?
Yep.
Perfect.
All right. Okay. So just heads up, Taylor, it has dumped me a couple of times here, but
Thanks for the heads up. I'll be ready to go if needed.
okay, good. Hopefully everything is good. And I can't tell if my logo background, which finally loaded, it's backwards, isn't it?
Looks good to me.
Oh, it does? It's not okay. So it's just showing up that way on my.
Yep. Nope. You're showing up the right way.
Perfect. Well, all right. Good to know. It looks like a mirror where I am, but I have clearly some Zoom setting issues today. All right. Well, we're right at 4 o'clock. So let's go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to our Thursday webinar series. Before I introduce our speaker, we'll go ahead and begin with our land acknowledgement. Taylor, if you want to. Crow Canyon Archaeological Center acknowledges the Pueblo, Ute, Paiute, Diné, and Hickory Apache people on whose traditional homelands our campus sits. Our work is not possible without Indigenous people in the past, present, and future, and we respectfully recognize and honor ancestral and descendant Indigenous communities for their contributions to all humankind. We are so grateful to all of our Indigenous people and partners, and we support the preservation and protection of cultural traditions, ancestral connections, and sacred lands. Thank you to all of our partners. I always start this with, if Zoom is giving you some headaches, which is giving me a few headaches today, but I don't have the option of heading over to our live stream on Facebook, but you can if your Zoom is giving you headaches. Also, if you have questions for Grant during the presentation, please pop them in the Q&A. They can just stay in there and we will get to them at the end of the presentation. And as always, if you haven't subscribed to our YouTube channel, please jump on and check out all of the past webinars. We have some, as usual, I know I say they're fabulous every week, but they are upcoming webinars next week, which is a part of our partnership with the Four Corners Lecture Series. We have my friend and colleague, Dr. Jonathan Dombrowski, who will be talking about 2 years of zooarchaeological research from our project here, the Northern Chaco Outliers Project. So please jump in next week with Jonathan. And the week after that, we have some interesting new speaker, a hidden history, an overview of African-American history in Northern Arizona with Margaret Hangen. So please, I hope to see everybody again in the next couple of weeks. A huge thank you, as always, entirely free webinar series, but so many of you make donations, sometimes every time that you watch. We're so grateful for you for making this entire series possible. And we are a nonprofit and we are entirely dependent on all of you. So thank you so much. And speaking of being a nonprofit, one of our fabulous employees who runs our plan giving program, Sarah Grace Pretzer, has added this slide for us to remind everybody there's only 2 or 3 days left in August, and August is National Make a Will Month. And thank you to everyone who has included Crow Canyon as a planned gift. We are so grateful. It's really huge for us. And for our future. So please, if you want any more information about this, just reach out to any of us and we will get you to Sarah Grace, who can talk you through what this looks like. All right, without further ado, I'm really excited this week and next week because it's particularly fun when we have our own archaeologists and scholars to present in the webinar series. And so I'm very pleased to introduce Grant Coffey, who is an archaeologist and the research database manager at Crow Canyon. He directed the second phase of the Goodman Point Archaeological Project from 2008 to 2011. He has more than 20 years of experience in the archaeology of the Four Corners and has published peer-reviewed research in American Antiquity, the Journal of Field Archaeology, the Journal of Anthropological Archaeology, and Kiva, and has contributed to many edited volumes. Much of his work at Crow Canyon has focused on Pueblo sites in the Goodman Point unit of the Hovenweep National Monument, and he's published articles about social organization and population movement in peer-reviewed professional journals. Grant is a team member of the Pueblo Farming Project. We were just discussing the corn earlier, which is a collaborative project between the Hopi tribe and Crow Canyon that began in 2008. In his current position as our research database manager, Grant manages 40 years of archaeological field data from the Pueblo Farming Project, and works with many stakeholders to provide access to data and technical support. He also serves as photogrammetry and GIS specialist at Crow Canyon, and he is currently our UAV, our drone operator, officially for Crow Canyon. And in his spare time, he likes fishing, hiking, and helping out on the family farm, and sometimes comes up and gives tours of his incredible family farm. Thank you so much for presenting today, Grant.
Yeah, thank you, Liz. Thanks for that great introduction. I appreciate it. Are we ready to share my screen?
You're all good.
All right, let me make sure I can do this right. How am I looking? Can you all see that slide?
Yep, you're coming through clear.
All right. Yeah, well, thanks again, Liz, for doing that. And thanks for all the people behind the scenes, Taylor and everybody who makes these webinars. Really a fantastic experience. It's great work y'all do, and thanks for having me today. I'm going to be talking about LiDAR data today, obviously. And I hope to do 3 things basically with this presentation. I hope to introduce folks to LiDAR that's become available for southwestern Colorado. Number 2, introduce a research project that we just initiated in the Research Institute here at Crow Canyon. And number 3, actually look at some of the really cool stuff you can see in the LiDAR data and think about how we're going to integrate this new data with kind of legacy data sets or other data types that we currently have in our various data sets. So moving forward, it's probably good to start with some definitions. What do I mean by LiDAR? Well, this is NOAA's definition, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. But essentially, it's shooting out pulse lasers and then measuring the bounce back of that light from where it was emanated from. And by doing this, you get really detailed topographical information, many points per a couple of meters. And it allows you to get a really high resolution look at the landscape. And As part of this, you can code individual points. So the ones that take the longest to bounce back from wherever the laser is being shot, those could be like the furthest away the actual ground surface of a given area. Whereas the ones that bounce back just a little bit quicker, and we're talking about speed of light here, bounce back just a little bit quicker could be the trees or shrubbery or some kind of land cover that's covering the bare earth. So one thing that we can do is we can actually take LiDAR data sets and create bare earth models of the Earth's surface. And oftentimes this laser data that's shot down and bounced back, it's really like a point cloud of data. All of these little individual points where the laser was shot down and bounced back. You can take those and you can code them based on how long it takes to get back. And then you can process them to just create a bare earth surface. Oftentimes this is something called a digital elevation model, which is kind of a continuous rendering of the elevation of the Earth's surface. So it really registers with really fine detail down to about a meter, a lot of the stuff we're going to be looking at, what the topography on the face of the Earth looks like. So in terms of modeling, how long have we been modeling at Crow Canyon? Well, we've been doing it a while in terms of the physical world. That vessel in the upper right-hand corner of the slide is actually a replica that Paul Ermaggiati produced from a vessel that was found at Canyon Pueblo. And that's actually a photogrammetry model of the vessel that Paul created. So it's a model of a model in some respects. We also have our Pueblo Learning Center, kind of in the center right there. It's actually a model of Pueblo 3 habitation, maybe from about AD 1150 to around 1225. What we think a lot of the habitation sites would look like around Cortez. But in terms of actually using lasers to model things, one of the first things we did at Crow Canyon was in 2008, we created a laser scan of this Kiva 107. And it was at Goodman Point, Pueblo, and it was part of the Goodman Point Archaeological Project. If you look down in that right-hand corner, you can see a gentleman with a white fedora down in here. That's Jim Holman. And he actually ran a company called Western Mapping. And if you can see in that lower right, there's also a device set up on a tripod. That's actually a laser scanner that we set up variously around this excavation unit, which is a 2x2 meter excavation unit. And did essentially what LiDAR is doing, only it's actually creating kind of a scan of the interior to get the geometry and the spacing and kind of the topography of the rocks and things. But it's doing essentially what LiDAR does in many respects. So we set up this device, took a lot of readings around the interior of this excavation unit, and we produced this model that you can find online if you go to that link below the image there that I just clicked on. This is actually a video reconstruction based on that LiDAR work, and then actually coming back in and draping digital images that were taken systematically around the interior over this point cloud data that was used to render the surface that we're looking at. So some things you can see, this is a masonry bench face inside the Kiva. These stacked stones right here are actually part of a pilaster or roof support. There are probably 6 of these around the interior. We'll see a reconstruction of that in just a minute. This straight up burn fill actually produced several tree ring specimens. And I think 2 or 3 actually got cutting dates, or the date that the tree actually died, right at 1265. So it looks like this particular Kiva was likely built, or at least remodeled, in the last 15 years before regional migration from the central Mesa Verde region. But hopefully you can see in this model, it's a lot more compelling in terms of, you know, its overall impact. You can draw a stratigraphic profile of an area like this and create a line drawing, and those are really precise and super useful. But actually being able to have that 3-dimensional depth along with the color texture of the soil, it's really a pretty compelling model. So just to orient folks maybe a little bit more, this is what we call a deflector stone that's set into the floor of the Kiva 107. This is a vent tunnel that would go horizontally back to a vertical vent shaft that would have provided fresh air to the structure during its use. This is another one of those pilasters that's set on this masonry bench that goes all the way around the structure. One really useful thing about a model like this is you can add to it. You can do what's being done as the video progresses. You can estimate where things were. This one probably had 6 pilasters or stone column roof supports sitting on top of the bench. You can see the vertical vent shaft back here that connects to the vent tunnel. This one had a really interesting hearth. It was actually remodeled at least twice during its occupation. And so you can do some really, really interesting things with laser scanning, just like you can with LiDAR. So this was 2008 when we did this during the Goodman Point project. Moving forward in time, kind of our next LiDAR foray was in 2018 when we partnered with Canyon of the Ancients National Monument and Routescene, which is a mapping company based out of the UK, and Caddis Aerial, who actually flew the drone. We flew drone-based LiDAR over San Canyon Pueblo, which is depicted in that image in the upper left-hand side. This is a reconstruction done by Dennis Holloway based on Crow Canyon excavation and mapping data, and it's set on a photo by Adriel Heisey. For folks who may not be familiar with San Canyon Pueblo, it's a really big, important site. There's about 90 kivas at San Canyon Pueblo. There's a great kiva, a really large D-shaped structure that was probably extra domestic and kind of a civic purpose for that structure. Enclosing wall. Really, a lot of work was done at San Canyon Pueblo, essentially from about, well, the San Canyon project ran from about 1983 to 1993, but a lot of the work was done in the late 80s, early 90s in terms of actually testing San Canyon Pueblo, where some individual kivas and room suites were tested at the site, but really pretty limited excavation. As you can probably tell in this image that was actually shot from the drone that was collecting the LiDAR, there's a lot of trees out there. Folks who've been out there probably know the entire site is covered with vegetation, primarily juniper and pinyon trees, but also some brush of various kinds, grasses. But it's really, really covered with pretty thick vegetation. If you look in this image to the lower left, you can see what kind of the raw data, the raw LiDAR data that was collected by the drone. You can probably get a sense that a lot of it are the trees and the vegetation that's covering the archaeological site. On the lower right hand, you can see the bare earth model that was created from all of these individual points of data that were included in the LiDAR. And what's the white lines that are superimposed on this kind of bare earth model, that's the actual map that Crow Canyon produced from their work as part of the Goodman Point project. So you can see there's pretty good correlation. Hopefully over on this kind of right-hand side, there's all of these white circles. Those are actually kiva depressions, kind of like kiva 107 that we just saw on the last slide. And they line up really well with where the bare earth model suggests they should be, as well as the great kiva, the D-shaped structure, and other things. So it was a really interesting project that I think showed the utility of doing drone-based LiDAR in this part of the world, especially in heavily vegetative context, a little bit prior to the release of kind of publicly available LiDAR data that we'll talk about in just a second. So this is another image of the bare earth model that was produced through that joint collaborative project. Hopefully you can still see all of these little circular depressions that represent kivas, big room blocks, the high areas. Really a great and interesting visualization of that site. What I'm going to bring up next is a visualization of the LiDAR data that's now freely available through the United States Geological Survey. And we'll just compare the two. And it's not really a fair comparison because how you process LiDAR data really has a lot to do with the visualization of the data itself. So this one is kind of an oblique angle looking at San Canyon Pueblo. If we click to bring in a model derived from the USGS LiDAR data, you can see that a lot of these things are more pronounced. And that's really an artifact, at least in part, of the processing that was used to create this model. There was a certain technique called visualization for archaeological topography that was developed by some folks in Slovenia. That's part of a toolbox that you can process these digital elevation models based on all these points of data to emphasize differences in a very near elevation. It also does things like it looks at hill shades multiple hill shades, 3, as a matter of fact, for this one. That would be where the sun would be when it's actually shining on the landscape to create that kind of shadowed effect. So instead of one direction that you often see in hill shades that are based on digital elevation model, this one takes into account several, and it takes into account other things like openness to the sky and things. But hopefully you can see this was proprietary software, a private company doing this as a demonstration. This is what's publicly available, processed in a very specific way. I would say that if we process this original drone data in a way that's similar to this, you'd probably get a lot crisper model than even we're looking at here. Because the drone collected a lot more points per square meter than the typical USGS fixed wing plane LiDAR collection. So anyway, just to give you an example, a lot of the stuff that's freely available today can make pretty compelling models that even a few years ago would be pretty costly in terms of getting a drone, buying the device, all the processing software, all the personnel involved. A lot of this is now freely available and open to archaeologists, and really changing the way we think about individual sites and landscapes. So this is the site actually where you can download the LiDAR data. There's a number of different ways you can do that. A lot of the stuff that we'll be looking at today was actually the LiDAR point cloud that we downloaded and we processed in a very specific way to create that. So all these points of data that we processed to create a bare earth digital elevation model, a continuous layer representing the surface of the earth. You can also download actual DEMs, these digital elevation models, directly without processing the raw point cloud. And there's pluses and minuses to doing either way. But for the extent we wanted to look at and kind of the standardization of much of the area that we wanted to look at, we actually processed the raw point cloud data. And I encourage folks to go to the USGS and look at the various maps they have available. There's some that actually show rendered LiDAR data, and they're really compelling, and you can search around them and look for things if you're interested in that. So now that we've got this LiDAR data from the USGS that covers pretty much most of the country, and certainly most of the Four Corners area where Crow Canyon does all of its work, what do we hope to do with that? Well, one initiative that we started here at Crow Canyon a couple months back is really focused on LiDAR data and how we can use that to augment what we know about large sites in the central Mesa Verde region. The image on the left, all of those white dots are what we would call community centers. So these are large sites, some people will call them villages, large sites that have 9 kivas or pit structures, or 50 surface rooms, or public architecture, or all 3. So we're talking about really pretty substantial settlements that can date from the Basket Maker 3 period, from about AD 500 to 750, all the way to the Terminal Pueblo 3 period, which would be, in the around 1280 AD. So really a long period of occupation, and a lot of work has been done at these really big sites because they are big and they're impressive, a lot of archaeological work. A lot of this work on community centers has been summarized in a recent chapter that came out last year, actually, in the book that's depicted on the right, that summarized 40 years of research, education, and American Indian initiatives at Crow Canyon. It's a really great book. And there's a chapter in there written by Dr. Donna Glowacki, Dr. Mark Varian, and myself that kind of talks about the history of study of these really big sites in the central Mesa Verde region. So that's a really great resource if you're curious about the history of community center studies and looking at these big sites on the landscape. And it's a really good question, why focus on the big sites? We don't focus on the big sites exclusively. We'll talk about some other projects that have specifically focused on small sites that are part of these large communities. But the thinking is that some of these really large sites with public architecture persisted longer on the landscape, and they probably had very important social roles, depending on which center you're talking about and at which period of time, in terms of the broader social fabric of the central Mesa Verde region. So really important to understand these as best we can in terms of how many people live there, the size of the sites, how they were interconnected, if they were interconnected, and really just be as thorough as we can in understanding kind of these population and civic ceremonial centers through time. So I obviously didn't do all of this work. All of these projects have contributed to our current community center database. And we're really standing on the shoulders of all these folks who are part of these projects, really beginning in 1983, with the Central Mesa Verde region as kind of the community center surveys. Just some other really important things that contributed to this database. Mark Varian's PhD dissertation, which was published in Sedentism and Mobility in a Social Landscape, looked at about 135 centers that are now part of this overall database. Dr. Donna Glowacki, now a professor at the University of Notre Dame, she expanded the regional extent of that and looked at it slightly differently, but she looked at 253. So really kind of a long-term, large landscape scale approach to looking at these big persistent places and trying to get the most fine-grained data we could use for synthetic analyses. And one of those projects in terms of synthetic analyses is the Village Ecodynamics Project, which really looked at human environmental interaction basically from AD 600 to AD 1300 over much of southwestern Colorado. That was later expanded into the Village Ecodynamics Project 2 that included some study areas in northern New Mexico along the Rio Grande. But really big synthetic studies that not only looked at community centers, but also took into account these smaller habitation sites and tried to create fine-grained data sets where you could look at population movement and demographics through time. So really important projects. Excuse me, some things that aren't on here that we've been doing recently. I should mention our new postdoctoral employee. Her name is Catherine Williams, Katie Williams. She's doing a really fantastic job of trying to pull together information from all of these different projects, as well as working with people who are actively working with LiDAR in the region. And in some ways, that's just as important as the existing community center data, working with folks like Winston Hurst over in Southeast Utah, Daniel Hampton, who's a PhD student at SUNY Binghamton. He's actually shared some data that we'll be looking at here in just a minute. But Katie is really actively working with folks, trying to find the best way to record the stuff that we're interested in and associate it with these community centers, and try to do it in a way that can be usable to other folks who are interested in this kind of stuff. Another thing that Katie's actively working on right now is trying to collaborate with Native American partners in this project. Before we really get going on any of the data collection or any kind of storage of this or any kind of publication, it's really important to get with folks who are interested in this from a Native perspective. She's trying to organize different meetings with tribal TIPOs and Teresa Pasquale, who's our Director of American Indian Initiatives, and really trying to make it a collaborative endeavor that's not purely science focused, but takes into account things that Native folks would like to see in terms of study, and really just kind of the appropriate way to do this at a large level. So Katie is really doing a lot of this hard work that builds on all of these projects that have contributed to the database itself. So what do we want to do more specifically? Well, one example, we could take the Hampton site. This is a really large, important site that's located near the Colorado-Utah border. This map was actually produced by Donna Glowacki, Dr. Fumiyasu Arakawa, Dave Johnson, Hugh Robinson as part of a 2002 community center survey. And it's a great map. You can see all of these circular objects that are present. Those are all kiva depressions. All of these kind of hashed areas are often multi-story surface architecture. So really a big important site. This is a great kiva that was recorded. This area kind of over to the left is probably maybe just a little bit earlier than this architectural area. This architectural area probably dates to the mid to late AD 1200s. Very similar to St. Canyon Pueblo in some respects and other big canyon head villages. But this was some of the initial data gathering that was done at the Hampton site. This is kind of the LiDAR data overlaying that. And if you toggle back and forth, you can see how much correspondence there is between the map that Donna et al. Produced and the LiDAR data itself. So it really speaks to the quality of work that those folks did in '02, laying the groundwork for understanding these large important sites on kind of a more detailed and regional level. But you can also see, you can develop and process this LiDAR data in such a way to make it much more visually impactful. You can do things like measure kiva depressions, measure spatial associations between things. And it just opens up a whole new avenue for looking at sites at the site level. And not only that, excuse me, grab a drink. But now that we have this continuous coverage over much of the central Mesa Verde region, we can start to look at landscape features outside of these big centers. And that's really what we're hoping to do. Incorporate other smaller sites, get some really quantifiable data about how many additional habitation sites and landscape features, things like roads between community centers and agricultural fields, how many things like that are out there and associated with some of these big sites. And we want to fold that kind of information, this landscape scale information, into a pretty detailed understanding of some of these community centers. It's important to remember when you're looking at the LiDAR data, I think, that the landscape has always been changing. And the way it looks today is very, very different, of course, than the way it looked when Ancestral Pueblo folks were living here. This is actually the original plat map for an area out at Goodman Point, where the Goodman Point unit of Hovenweep National Monument is located. This is actually an 1889 plat map that was in part developed by a guy named W.D. Harlan, who is the land inspector for the General Land Office in Denver. And if you can see, in certain areas, they were pretty observant. They call this the ruin of Aztec City. Obviously, we wouldn't use that type of language today. We know the Aztecs weren't hanging out around this part of the world. Ancestral Pueblo, we would use that term today, but this is the location of Goodman Point Pueblo, actually. And all of this area up in here where it says ruins, tower ruins, again, historic language being expressed, but it really points to kind of a keen eye of these land inspectors noticing the importance and the density of the cultural remains that were present out there. And in fact, on a recommendation from W.D. Harlan in 1889, he made a recommendation to the Secretary of the Interior, a guy named Noble, to reserve this entire section from homesteading. And that actually happened later in that fall. So it's one of the first areas where a parcel of land was actually put aside by the federal government to partially protect the cultural resources that are there. Over the years, that original section that was preserved got whittled down to the 143 acres of the Goodman Point unit today. And that's going to be the point of the next slide. It's going to be a series of images, aerial images that go from 1937 up to 2009. And don't worry if you don't catch everything the first time through. We'll have a chance to watch it a couple of times. But it's really just to show you kind of the landscape change around the Goodman Point unit from 1937 to 2009. So this is 1937. This area up in here is the general area for Shields Pueblo. You can see it's really pretty intensively farmed by 2000. 1937, all of these trees were present. By 1960, they're almost all gone. By 73, everything is gone. It's kind of a similar situation out to the west, where a lot of this agricultural land is getting cleared up for row cultivation. And it's really being modified extensively. One thing to keep your eye on the next series is kind of this area right in here. That's the Goodman Point unit. 1937, not a whole lot of vegetation. By 1960, it's coming back. Given its preservation since 1889 and actually fencing much later, you can see how that landscape has preserved so much better than the surrounding areas that have been cleared for agriculture. So all of these things really play into interpreting LiDAR data, and try not to make mountains out of molehills, making a plow furrow road segment. It really takes some kind of interpretation and some ground truthing that we'll get into here in just a little bit. So one of the big things from the data that we're seeing right now is roads are way more prevalent Ancestral Pueblo roads are way more prevalent in this neck of the woods than we ever thought before. This site being depicted on the right is a site called the Ansel Hall site, which is located out near Cajon, Colorado, and it's administered by the Canyon of the Ancients National Monument. We actually did a reassessment of this site in 2017 with the idea of trying to collect more detailed data on community centers where we had relatively scant information. This site was actually mapped in the 80s by a gentleman named Art Rohn, and subsequent to that, there was a National Register nomination that was created by Bruce Bradley, Dr. Bruce Bradley, who's a local archaeologist. So there have been a lot of work, but not any really detailed mapping since the 80s. So we went back out and looked for things like kiva depressions, did additional pottery tallies, that kind of thing. It's a really interesting site because it has a Chaco-era great house that probably dates from around AD 1060 to around AD 1150. It's got a great kiva, and then all of these black dots are pit structures that we've recorded. Kiva depressions or pit structure depressions. So really kind of a dense community with public architecture. This great house has above ground blocked in kivas. Really an interesting site. One thing to kind of note, we only thought one possible road segment, this kind of white rectangular area here. We said, well, maybe that could be a road segment. But when you get the LiDAR data, you can definitely see, and we're looking at the same site, just with the LiDAR data, you can definitely see that there is a road that goes through there. This would be about the section we thought we could see, but it really makes the Great Kiva and the Great House pop to a really cool degree. Ansel Hall, he was the first naturalist for the National Park Service, and he had a program in the 40s called Explorer Group for Boys. And they would go around the Southwest doing various kind of adventurous things. And one thing they did was come and excavate at this particular site. And that's where the name Ansel Hall comes from. So it's got kind of an interesting history. Some of the folks involved in that 2017 survey are pictured in that image over on the left. You've got Dr. Kelsey Reese on the furthest left. She was actually instrumental in some of our first LiDAR work here at Crow Canyon. Dr. Kyle Basinski, University of Montana. This is Dr. Mark Varian, who is the executive vice president of the Research Institute at the time this work was done. And over on the right is Jerry Fetterman, who was the former owner-operator of Woods Canyon Archaeological Consultants and knows a lot about archaeology in this neck of the woods, a whole lot. One person not pictured there is Dr. Donna Glowacki from University of Notre Dame, but I think I got a picture of her later. So all these roads, there's a lot of variability. Some of them are circular, some of them are really big in scale, some of them are more internal and straight. And so trying to sort out typology for these landscape features is one of the things we're trying to work with collaborators on, so that we're talking kind of apples to apples. And it's really an exciting time to be looking at these large things and working with others to try to sort out how we're going to discuss this. And I think those conversations with Native partners will really help fill in and help guide, in fact, the discussion on how to think about these in interpretive terms. But just morphologically, there's a lot of variability. And we'll look at a little bit of that. This is a site called Brewer Mesa Top, again, over by the Utah-Colorado state line. It's got probably the remnants of a Chaco great house kind of here in the central area with some additional architecture around it. But hopefully you can see really faintly the circular feature that goes all the way around it. And actually, Susan Ryan and Katie Williams and I went out to this a few weeks ago, and we tried to locate where this circular feature may actually intersect with this fence. This Katie Williams, our rock star postdoc, but she's actually standing in a little bit, hopefully you can tell in that photo, it's a little bit of a swale there where she's taken a GPS point that's probably pretty close to where that is. But hopefully in this image, it gets some sense of how difficult ground truthing some of this can be, because it looks really evident on the LiDAR, but you get out on the landscape and it can be really hard to see. And that's probably why a lot of these things haven't been documented, because you almost can't see them at all unless you have the LiDAR data with you. So there's roads that connect communities too, kind of a larger scale. This is a road that connects Casa Negra, which is out by San Canyon Pueblo, located on private property, up to a site called Shields Pueblo, which is north of the Goodman Point unit. This image on the top left, I actually took from kind of the southern great house here, looking to the north and west. That's Kyle Basinski on top of the other mound. So hopefully that gives you some sense of the size of these great houses, these Chaco-era great houses that again date from about AD 1060 to 1150. Most of them are really tall and imposing structures. This has all been cultivated where the red arrows are. So the fact that you can still see this road after cultivation, at least beginning in the 30s, probably earlier, probably really speaks to how pronounced it was during the Ancestral Pueblo occupation. And there's even ethnographic work that's been done out there by Marjorie Connolly that discussed part of this. And they said when some of the first Anglo settlers first moved in, you could ride a horse down there, down the road itself, and the only thing visible of the horse rider would be like his waist up. So it would have been really pronounced prior to the time that all this agricultural cultivation occurred. So roads connect communities and other features. This is our old friend, the Hampton site. And hopefully you can see this linear feature extending to the north and east where those red arrows are. If you follow that out, you actually end up at the Brewer Mesa top site that we talked about just a little bit ago. Big sections of it are totally gone. And we'll talk about how that ground truthing is going for this particular feature. But in this case, it actually connects to communities and it runs near these really interesting parallel linear ridge and swell systems that a lot of folks are doing work with, specifically Winston Hurst and Fred Niles over in Southeast Utah. Other people are looking at them. I know folks at Woods Canyon are looking at them. But it's possible these are agricultural features that were created by Ancestral Pueblo folks to produce corn and other crops. But we'll talk more about that in just a minute. I guess right now, this is a really big system of those parallel lines. So hopefully you can see what I mean. There's little ridges and then there's little swales in between the ridges. And they run, this series of ridges actually run kind of east-west. And all of this area up in here has this signature in the LiDAR data. The stuff that Winston Hurst and others are identifying in Southeast Utah, if these are in fact the agricultural features that many think they are, it's a tremendous scale. There's thousands and thousands of acres in Southeast Utah. Less have been identified in southwestern Colorado because of the degree of land disturbance. But really an intriguing avenue for future research, trying to gather additional data, take Native partners out there to look at these things and see what folks ultimately think they're used for. But if they are agricultural features, as many suggest, boy, there's a lot of them, and it's on really a monumental scale across southwestern Colorado and southeastern Utah. Our old friend Ansel Hall, I won't beat this one to death, but definitely roads within communities. They're not always straight like this one that runs from the Great House up by the Great Kiva. Some of them are those circular roads that actually connect different important buildings within the community, things like a Great House and a Great Kiva, except they're circular, more like the ones that we saw at Brewer Mesa top. This is a image of what a portion of the Great House here at Ansel Hall still looks like. And this is an image of Donna Glowacki actually doing some of the work out there. So really cool. This is processed in a slightly different way. This is using that visualization for archaeological topography. And this is just another rendering of the road. And actually this big trench in the Great Kiva, that was actually excavated, I believe, by Ansel Hall and the Explorer Group for Boys in the 40s. Other examples, so you have straight lines within communities, you have these circular features within communities. This is an example from Lowry Pueblo, which also has a Chaco-era great house depicted right here. 10s, 1100s, some post 1100 stuff, and even prior 1000 stuff at Lowry, a great kiva. But hopefully you can see this big kind of elliptical road that runs between the great house, which would be situated right here, and the great kiva, which is situated right there. Field truthing is critical for all of these features. You can't just look at it and say, well, that's obviously road. This linear segment out at the Hampton site could be an ancient road, or it could be a wagon trail. There's a good spring down here. So you actually need to get out on the landscape and look at these things. This, actually, I walked out here with Jack Hampton, who's the current owner of this. He actually sold this section to the Archaeological Conservancy. But last July, I walked out here with him, and you can see where the road is right through here is actually this section, kind of right through here on the aerial. So you can see that today it's pretty well covered with trees and things. But once you walk out there, there's old growth juniper trees that are growing along the course of this. And there's actually a partially excavated Pueblo 2 site here. But you can walk along it and see that those trees have been there for a really long time. There's no incised wagon ruts, that kind of thing that would make you believe it's a more modern 2-track or wagon road. It really looks to be old. But field truthing things like this, I walked across this. I kind of walked north to south across it. If you know exactly where you're at on the LiDAR and you know exactly what you're looking at, you can kind of see all of these kind of gentle ridges and swales, but boy, it's difficult. And so when we say field truthing or ground truthing, it's really hard to do in the absence of some kind of limited testing to look at stratigraphy and get samples from the modern ground or from subsurface deposits. So just give you some potential scale of these features. This is the community centers, again, a portion of them kind of on the McElmo Dome north and west of Cortez, Colorado, all of the white dots, but all of the black and green lines are actual road segments that have been identified or suggested by Daniel Hampton, who has been kind enough to share this data in kind of our planning phase for what we want to do in terms of collecting data for these community centers. But in all of these black and green lines that are depicted on the slide, there were maybe 2 or 3 that were known. And now you've got all of this just in one small portion of the landscape. So you can see it's really exponentially changing our understanding of landscape features and connections between some of these really large and persistent sites. But as with anything, there are always limitations. This is an artist rendering of the Dillard site, which was part of the Basket Maker Communities project, our previous field project prior to the Northern Chaco Outlier project. Really an important site. It looks like a Basket Maker 3 village that was probably built and occupied from AD 500 to AD 750, really more in the 600s primarily. But there is a great kiva kind of in the middle. And then there's several pit structures on the north side. This view is kind of to the south and west. So this would be the north side. Several pit structures, surface structures, storage features, and then a similar setup just to the south of the great kiva. Which would have been kind of a civic ceremonial public space. But if you go to look at that on the LiDAR, it doesn't look anything like Hampton or Sand Canyon or any of these later sites where you have more robust surface architecture. And that's partly because the site was built much earlier and the surface architecture and even the pit houses were a lot more ephemeral in terms of their overall signature on the landscape. So when they collapse and they've had more time to be collapsed and covered with post-abandonment sediments, it's almost impossible to see where it is. Looking all across here, you could take several guesses, but this is actually where the Dillard site is. You can see the extent of the Great Kiva very mildly, but there's really no signature of those other structures. And again, that's because of the age that they've been decommissioned and just the general morphology of the architecture. Moving forward in time, this is a Pueblo 1 site that the Archaeological Conservancy recently acquired. It's called the Knuckles Preserve. But in the foreground, this is a surface room block. And maybe you can see some stones and get a sense that there's a really gentle ridge here that comprises the room block. The room block runs all the way down and behind this truck that's parked right there, circled in red, and comes back around and ties into the other side. Still pretty ephemeral architecture, definitely not like a big masonry pueblo that's collapsed. The site is in really good condition overall. There has been a little bit of looting and potholing historically. This is a surface room that's been excavated. You can see these big slabs that would have been framing a room here. hopefully it gives you some sense that it's not as subtle as some of the Basket Maker 3 surface architecture, which would have been mainly post and Adobe construction. These kind of structures would have had stone linings, partially covered masonry on top of these slabs, would have been post supported with kind of a wattle and daub or earthen superstructure. So still pretty subtle, but a little bit more robust than what we think a lot of the Basket Maker 3 architecture would have looked like. So looking at the LiDAR for this one, the last photo that I showed, I was standing right about here, taking the image looking this direction. So you can see, you can sort of see the room block, but this portion right here could easily be dismissed as maybe like a rock pile where farmers are clearing rocks out of their field and piling them on the corner. Parts of this you could definitely look at and wonder if that's representing surface architecture, but a really subtle signature, but much more evident than some of the bigger Basket Maker 3 sites we dug out, again, because of the nature of the surface architecture and the signature that's left when structures are decommissioned. This is a little bit different processing showing the extent of the room blocks. As it's mapped now, it's a really big Pueblo 1 site, probably primarily dating from the mid to late 800s. There's 14 different room blocks with about 800 meters of room block length. So really big and regionally important one that the Archaeological Conservancy thankfully recently acquired. So it looks like I might be getting close on time, but I'll show a few more slides. Of course, LiDAR is not the only game in town, and sometimes other techniques are better for actually capturing what you want to depict. So on the right and on the bottom, those are stills that were taken out of a three-dimensional model that was created using photogrammetry. So to do that, we took about just under 3,000 photos, overlapping photos, and stitched them all together using the location of the camera when they were taken to render what we were photographing in 3D. And that's really a simplified way to say it. But it's all done with photographs, digital photographs collected at a high resolution and overlapping and using a software. At the time, it was Agisoft Photoscan. Now it's Agisoft Metashape. But it does a similar thing. It renders things in 3D. This is the East Great House at the Haney site, which is really the focus of our Northern Chaco Outliers project. Have some tree ring dates from the 1100s. Early 1100s primarily, may date a little bit either side of that. In fact, there's definitely some Pueblo 3 stuff that would be 1150 to 1280 recovered from here. And we know that there's a significant Pueblo 1 occupation underneath. And webinar next week, I'm sure John will give you a lot more detail on the Haney site and in previous webinars, but really an important structure. It was unfortunately heavily looted prior to the time that the Archaeological Conservancy acquired it. So a lot of mechanical excavation and all of these kivas that you see here, which is really, really unfortunate. But what it does do is it opens itself up to kind of preservation and documentation using photogrammetry. Comparing that to the LiDAR, this particular structure would be located right here. And if you're looking at the bare earth LiDAR that's been produced, it effectively washes it out because of the vertical nature of these kiva walls and things and how steep the drop off is. In the processing, it treats it like a modern house where it wants to wash away those really close vertical differences and only retrieve the basal points in the LiDAR cloud. So just in terms of processing for the ground DEM, ground hillshade that this is, it really washes it out, and a technique like photogrammetry is much, much better to use. And that's true of any kind of vertical face that's not planier and where it's actually representing cultural stuff, it seems. Just a couple more. This is a really interesting site called the Crosspatch site that we're looking at. It's owned by Gary Weinmeister, who's depicted there in the middle. Really nice guy. It also was heavily looted in the 70s and 80s. It's got a really significant 8900s component, which is interesting. It's also got a component that goes well into the 1000s and the 1100s as well. Really a persistent place for a long period of time. All of those red circles that you see in this figure to the left, those are what we think were excavated kivas or pit structures. Again, a backhoe was used. But we created this map using drone photogrammetry. So we flew it over, created kind of an orthomosaic, stitching all those photos together. And then from that, you can create a digital elevation model that's very similar to the ones that's created from LiDAR, just a little bit different, different methodology. And, you know, we use things like we put plates, just paper plates and everything we thought that represented an excavated kiva or pit structure. And you could recognize that in the drone imagery. And then you could use that to draw in these things just to do some kind of quick and basic documentation of the site. You can take this legacy data, stuff like the drone data that we collected at Crosspatch, and you can plop it right onto LiDAR data to look for areas where you were right, where you've got good congruence between the two data sets, areas where you were wrong, areas that need better definition. And in fact, Gary's granddaughter, Jessica, has created a much more detailed map than this as part of her master's work on the site. And she's also currently a PhD student at SUNY Binghamton. So she's really improved on this, but hopefully it shows you can do some initial data, plop it onto the LiDAR, and then compare the two to look for what you're missing in either one. And it just provides a really great level of detail at the site level. Also at the landscape level, this is Crosspatch in the red circle here in the middle. And although the white line there is thought to be a portion of the Belt Loop Road that Daniel Hampton actually identified and passed along. There's all these other roads that connect variously to other parts of the landscape. These black lines, this one running kind of south and west. If you follow it out, it would actually end up very close to the Ansel Hull site that we looked at previously, which would be partly contemporary with parts of Crosspatch. This one that runs out to kind of the west-southwest, if you follow it out, it goes out to a really important site that's called Champagne Springs, which Dave Dove and others have done a lot of work at, that also has a very significant 900s component. So all of this data, I think, is really just showing us how connected the landscape is in ways that we never thought about before and didn't think was possible from just looking at things on the ground. But it's given us a whole new avenue of research for trying to understand how communities were connected through time through formal landscape features. Jensen site, it's also a Chaco outlier site. It's got a Chaco Great House right here in the middle. This site is owned by Deb and Bob Jensen, and they were kind enough to let us go out there and do a combination of drone mapping and total station work to produce this kind of base map. The image in the upper left really shows kind of the ortho photos, all the photos stitched together that was used to create a DEM that was then used to create all of the stuff that you see on this map. All of these, like this and this and this, those are all room blocks. These are all kiva or pit structure depressions. It's got an oversized, maybe a court kiva associated with the Great House, really similar to the Ansel Hull we saw. Again, probably 1000s to 1100s with little evidence, especially at Jensen, of post 1200 occupation. But you can take all this data that you gathered initially, drop it directly onto the LiDAR, which was done here, and you can look for things that you may have messed up in one stage of the process, or add things additionally, or ground truth stuff. So in addition to opening up this landscape level analysis, it's really helping to fine tune site-specific maps and our understanding of how many people may have lived there and when. So in terms of Jensen, it's this red circle on the landscape. All of these green lines and black lines that kind of go down this direction are probably roads or trails that are running to the Lakeview community. So the Haney site we were talking about is this dot right here. There's actually 4 different great houses included in the Lakeview group, but you can actually see how these great houses may have actually been physically and symbolically connected via some of these road segments that Daniel has passed along. I'm running out of time, so I'm just gonna kind of skip to the end here. But LiDAR's moving forward is going to be a central piece of tying a bunch of different spatial data together, whether it's collected by a drone, a total station, which is kind of a laser transit that gives you a really highly accurate position on the landscape, photogrammetry models. All of those things can be used in conjunction with the LiDAR data that's become publicly available to archaeologists across the Southwest, and which many people are actively working on. It's going to be a really important part of integrating all of the spatial data that we've already collected and how we do it moving forward. A lot of different potential projects or products and uses for these projects, things like research. You can create shareable data and with known processing parameters between archaeologists, so that you're talking apples to apples when you're assessing roads and landscape features and that kind of thing. Education, photogrammetry models, say of the Haney East Great House. You could use that to try to calculate the amount of stone and mortar that was used to create something like this, a pilaster roof support, and include that in kind of STEM education. Outreach, specifically for our Native partners. Not all elders and other really important folks can come out and visit these places on the landscape. But if you have a really accessible and kind of compelling model to pass along and share, you can, have some really interesting discussions with Native folks and actually do some work that in places where they just may be interested in a particular place. Preservation, these really highly accurate models. And in terms of the LiDAR data, the roads and really subtle things that are on the surface, trying to manage that from a land manager's perspective and actually identify a lot of these things. So there's just a lot of different potential uses for the products that come from this kind of work. So looking forward, we really need to collaborate with Native folks to determine kind of the course forward. What's the most appropriate way to do this? Things that they may be interested in that we're not even considering at this point. And we need to do the same thing with regional archaeologists so that we're collecting data that's interpretable across projects and that will be useful for a wide variety of research interests. Use LiDAR data as just part of our routine documentation process. And update what we know on some of these big important landscapes that we've been studying for years and years. So thank you. Thank you to all the folks below. Thank you to History Colorado, NSF, who funded different parts of this work. Really appreciate it. And there's many more that should be mentioned, but it's truly a collaborative effort and it's really exciting. It's great to have Katie Williams on board, who's really marshaling kind of Crow Canyon's effort on this front. So yeah, really exciting time to be an archaeologist for sure. And that's all I have.
Thank you so much, Grant. That was spectacular presentation. Oh dear, am I freezing up here?
Your face is a little bit frozen.
I am. We have oh dear. Taylor, I don't know if I am.
I'll get us kicked off with the first question.
Great.
Can the USGS LiDAR be improved by, say, a private company or Crow Canyon?
I think almost definitely, and especially there's metadata about each LiDAR project that the USGS did that talks about when it was completed, kind of the LiDAR quality. And from kind of the San Canyon Pueblo example I gave, the proprietary software allows you, and the device and the entire setup allows you to get the precise coverage you want, however many points per meter that you're desiring. You can slow down the drone, you can take it repeatedly. So definitely you could collect data that's more precise and probably accurate than the USGS data sets that are available. Of course, there's a trade-off in terms of time and cost. And for most of what we're initially looking at, the USGS data will be more than suitable to tackle some of that initial stuff.
Everybody's frozen for me, Taylor, so I'm not sure if I'm coming through, but I think we're right about at 5 o'clock, and maybe we go ahead and wrap up.
Yeah, that's totally fine, Liz.
Okay, I'm staring at a terrible frozen face, and I do think Grant got to quite a few of the questions that turned up in the Q&A during his talk. So thank you all so much for coming, and stay tuned for more information on our LiDAR related initiatives from the Research Institute. And thank you, Grant, so much for sharing all of this with us.
You bet. Thanks everybody for coming. Thanks for having me. It's a good time.
Okay, great. All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a great evening.